All right. Well, welcome everyone. Like Sammy said, happy Valentine's Day. We have secret hidden Valentine's Day symbols throughout our presentation. And if you want some entertainment, you can count those as we go along. We don't know how many there are, but you can tell us. Um, so that's a little bit of added fun for today. So this is our last session together. We've enjoyed having you all meet with us every other week to talk about community-based social marketing. And today's a great session for bringing it all together, allowing you to reflect on whether or not you're prepared or it's feasible with the resources that you have for you to do your campaigns and allow you to think a bit more about them. So here's a bit more about our plan. We're going to do a brief recap on the last workshop like we did last time. Good opportunity for any questions or clarifications, either from your thinking about it since the last meeting, or if you watched the video and had some questions that you didn't get to ask, or just things that you're thinking about now as you move on to the next component. Then, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about what are your resources that you have right now within your organization, and how does that compare with what you're looking at doing with your strategies, and if you identify any gaps, an opportunity for you to think about how you might address those gaps, or how might you edit your plans for your strategies so that they're more feasible. And then the last bit is we're going to talk about the evaluation components. How do your plans track to outputs that you might expect or outcomes that you might expect, and how can you set yourself up so that you are all ready to be measuring those things from the start. Okay, so workshop recap. And as a hint, we've started with the Valentine's symbols for those who are going to count as we go along. They look a little scary, but just think of them as being birds that are happily in love. Okay, so as we've shared with you each time, there's 5 steps in community-based social marketing: selecting a behavior to promote, identifying the benefits and constraints to the behavior. And last time we talked a lot about developing a strategy to promote the behavior, which we'll be refining today. And then there's also the steps of piloting the strategy on a localized scale, which you heard about some of the pilot projects that have been conducted in the past, and then implementing it broadly and evaluating it. And today we'll talk about how you can evaluate effectively. So when you're selecting a behavior in step 1, you want to determine what that behavior is, make sure it's really something that is having a biological or natural resources effect on your area of interest, so that it will be useful to work on that to minimize your disturbance. As part of that, you also need to identify who are the people taking that action, and what is the really specific action that you're talking about. Then you want to identify alternative actions that would be things that people might want to do, and that would be worthwhile to promote because you might expect that people would be willing to do it. Not everyone, but a good chunk of people. And then you think about, is there a way to make sure that you can be really clear on what this action is, so that you know that you're actually talking with people about the same thing that they think that they're hearing you talk about. And then finally, you ensure that your behavior has an end state, that it's really going to produce the desired outcome and goal that you're looking for. In step 2, identifying benefits. We've talked about the benefits to dog walkers, the benefits to beach walkers, both of these from past surveys that Carolyn Comer conducted during her master's degree. And they were of beach recreationists on the Atlantic Flyway. And then also identifying constraints, so the things that people perceive as their barriers to being able to take the action that you're looking for. So you can see the constraints related to leashing dogs and the constraints related to walking dogs around flocks of birds. And the goals of identifying the benefits and the constraints are, you want to be able to maximize your benefits and minimize your constraints. So then we've also talked about communications best practices, really emphasizing what matters to the audience. I talk about trying to think about walking in the shoes of the recreationist that you are going to be talking with in your community-based social marketing campaign. What matters to them? Why would they want to do whatever bird-friendly action it is that you are interested in? Have a really clear ask for them. Allow them to feel a connection to the birds, and also think about ways to use social norms or people's thoughts about what other people think they should be doing around audience values, and try to simplify what it is that you're asking people to do and prompt them so that they remember it at the point that they actually would be taking the behavior. So last time we talked about external factors, and you all did an awesome job of brainstorming a variety of factors that exist either on the social or the environmental context of where people are recreating and where you're going to be conducting your campaigns. So it's really helpful for you to think about those specific to your site. Hopefully you've had time to think about that a little bit more since we met last time. And given those contexts, then you can start to think about which strategies would be feasible for your site. And we talked about how there's 7 different types of strategies. You can see the list here again, and you have those on your summary sheet from last time. Commitment, convenience, incentives, prompts, social diffusion, social norm, and communications. And you may decide at your site to use 2, 3, maybe even 4 of these different strategies. And they could look different at your site than they do at someone else's site. But these are all approaches that community-based social marketing emphasizes because they have been found through social science research to have an effect in encouraging people to take environmentally friendly behaviors. And then piloting your project, as you heard last time, the various sites that we've worked with in the community of practice that you can see here in this photo have tried out their campaigns at their sites over the course of a breeding season. And they've learned a lot from doing so. And that allows them then to think about adjustments they want to do in the future before they continue to do that approach at more sites or put even more resources into their campaigns. And then finally, the implementing broadly piece. And lots of times when people think about evaluation, they think like, oh, that's the thing that I do at the end. Really, you want evaluation to start right at the beginning. And we're going to talk more about how to use logic models, or at least parts of logic models. We're not going to spend time today doing the whole entire logic model process, but components of it that can really help you align your strategies with the resources that you have. Also, maybe thinking back to the context that you're working in, the goals of what you want to achieve, and then setting you up to measure the outputs and outcomes of the behavior throughout the process. All right, so I'm going to pause here and see if there's any questions. A reminder that you can share those questions with us. It looks like, do we even have the Q&A set up today, or are we just doing it through the chat? Okay.
Just through the chat.
Okay, we're just doing them through the chat today. So if you have any questions, feel free to place those in the chat or raise your hand, and we're happy to answer those. But hopefully those steps of community-based social marketing are feeling even more comfortable to you as we've gone through them in various ways each time. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions now, but if anyone has any, feel free to drop them in the chat as we go along. And I think I'm going to turn it over to Sammy.
Cool, thank you. So the next step of community-based social marketing is really emphasizing this evaluation piece. And while community-based social marketing is a really widely used framework that thousands of practitioners across many different fields have used, there's still kind of a gap in our understanding of the outcomes of these campaigns, and that's largely due to just limited evaluations that are done to assess these outcomes. So, as Ashley mentioned, based on our lessons learned and our experiences, we really want to prioritize integrating and thinking about evaluation early so we know how these campaigns are influencing our audiences. So when we think about evaluation, we're referring to the process of assessing a program's effectiveness or outcomes, which can help reveal areas of improvement. It can lead to more informed decision making. And in the context of CBSM campaigns, evaluation can also help determine what strategies are most feasible to implement and then help understand how and why they're working or not working. So typically when we hear about our evaluation, as Ashley was mentioning, we likely think about something that happens at the end. And we even see this in the CBSM framework where the last step recommends implementing broadly and evaluating. But as I mentioned, we really can't stress enough how important it is to think about evaluation early and often to set yourself up and your campaign up for success. So this is because when we think about evaluation from the beginning, we know what to plan for. And including evaluation early in the planning process can really help to identify metrics to determine if your campaign is achieving its goals, which then allows you to allocate resources by knowing what to measure and ultimately design a campaign that can be adapted based on these insights. And then additionally, thinking about evaluation early and planning for it can really help alleviate some of the concerns and limitations that often prevent evaluations from occurring in the first place. So things like limited staff and financial support, these can be really big barriers to evaluations. So we want to know upfront what we can do and what's realistic to do. So our goal with the rest of this workshop is to think about some of the ways we can integrate evaluation into these campaigns without increasing the workload, but still giving you some kind of indication of what's working and not working. And participating in this series and filling out the campaign plan template is really the starting point for this evaluation planning. So as I mentioned, in the context of CBSM, evaluation can help select feasible strategies and understand what's working and what's not working. And one side of that is understanding the social and environmental factors at your site that may influence what's even possible to implement. So we use these external factors to kind of guide our decision making, since they'll ultimately determine how the audience can interact with the behavior you're trying to promote. And so, as we mentioned, this is what we dove into last session, thinking about, how our external factors can shape what strategies might be the best fit for our site. And then based on that discussion, we asked you all to come to today's session with 2 to 3 strategies that you think might be interesting or might work for your site. And so from there, we then have to assess the feasibility of those potential strategies by looking internally at our resources, especially because you may have left last session wanting to implement all the strategies after seeing those really great examples. But realistically, it's ideal to kind of focus your attention on just a few of them and implement them really well instead of getting overwhelmed at all the things at once. So this kind of leads us to thinking about our inputs. So essentially, inputs are what you can contribute to your campaign. So these can be financial resources, personnel, maybe you have some interns or a really great volunteer base, time, equipment, things like decoys, signs, or more, partnerships, expertise, knowledge, any other necessary material and non-material resources that might be useful for your campaign and to implement these strategies. And then it's also important to note that different behavior change strategies require different resources. So instead of considering everything at once, we'll do a short exercise to kind of help narrow our focus. So by asking key questions, we can kind of determine what's needed and identify any resource gaps and then decide where to allocate our resources effectively. So here's an example. So if I'm thinking about implementing prompts, which is a really good strategy because they require really little time and effort, but they can be really effective if they're strategically placed. So if I want to implement that, I might ask myself, can I place a sign where and when this behavior occurs? So the first thing I need to know is where and when the behavior is taking place. So the placement of my sign really depends on the behavior I'm trying to promote. So it could be something like encouraging people to walk around flocks of birds, and that's going to be different from promoting leashing dogs. One might be placed on the beach while the other sign might be placed in a parking lot. So I really need to know where those high traffic areas are. And then I might think about the tools I have to install the sign. So maybe I have all of that in my office. I'm good to go on that front. And then I also might think about the permits I need to secure in order to place the sign exactly where I want it. So if I don't have a permit yet, I know that's a gap that I need to address. And then I should also ask myself if I want to implement prompts, do I have the resources to make these signs and maintain them? So maybe I have access to some graphics and a really great intern who does amazing artwork. So I'm good on that front. But maybe I'm a little low on funding or for printing. So I need to think about how to apply for a small grant or just allocate my funds to plan ahead. So this is just kind of a way to think about resources by asking yourself questions about implementing them and then thinking backwards about the resources you'll need to answer those questions. So hopefully that kind of helped you think about some of the ways we can identify what we need in order to implement these strategies. So now we're going to just take 5 minutes on your own to work on this worksheet, which we'll post the link in the chat if you haven't downloaded it already, to think about the strategies that you came in with in mind today, and then think about what resources you might need and some key questions you need to ask in order to implement that strategy. So also make sure that you separate somehow what you have versus what you need. You can do that different color, circle, underline, whatever works best for you. And then we'll come back and discuss in breakout groups and smaller breakout groups. Hey. Well, hopefully you got a start on jotting down some resources that you have or that you think you might need in order to implement some strategies. And if you didn't get that far, that's okay. We're going to break out into some breakout rooms, and that peer-to-peer sharing can also reveal, what we missed or what we didn't think about that others are also thinking about for implementing their different strategies or maybe the same strategy. So in breakout, we're going to do breakout groups. We'll have 6 groups. We have some facilitators here to kind of help, um, you know, work our conversations and talk about some of the inputs that we mentioned or that you brainstormed in this little self activity. So we'll talk for about 10 to 15 minutes. It can be pretty informal, just talking about what are some of the things that you notice that you have a lot of gaps on. What are some of the things that you know that or sound really important? And then we'll just share with each other. So I'm going to open the breakout groups, and we'll be there for 10 to 15 minutes.
Super fun to hear from folks, and we didn't have enough time, as always happens in breakout groups. But I really enjoyed in mine, and I'm sure it was the case in other ones, that we had people from both coasts and all up and down the coasts, and in between we had a Great Lakes people too. So that was a lot of fun.
Okay, so as Ashley mentioned, we had lots of folks join us. So we're just going to briefly go over some of the themes, maybe resources, resource gaps that were talked about. I can start. So we also had folks from all over join our call. And some of the main things that I mentioned or that I heard were kind of first starting about thinking about inputs related to like what we're already doing. So I think a lot of us can look at these strategies and think, I'm kind of already doing that, or I have programs that are doing these, but maybe not to the specific framework or not as pinpoint, or the ask maybe is not as digestible. So kind of starting there is a good place of like, how can I refine what I'm already doing? We also talked about partnering with organizations who are doing similar goals or have programs already in place. Where can we kind of meet in the middle? We talked about, social media presence and physical pamphlets, and a lot of brainstorming of different strategies and how they might look like. Ashley, do you want to share next?
Yeah, I'll just emphasize one thing from our group. We had a lot of conversation about the need for having just bodies, people on the beach. One of our sites was talking about how they have 34 different entrances to our beach, and another site was talking about how there's just, hundreds of people there, thousands of people there, and miles of beach, and chicks running in between all of them. So, in these cases, it's really helpful to have a strong volunteer base of people who can be out on the beach having positive interactions with beachgoers and pointing out what the plovers, in most cases, our sites were looking at snowy plovers or piping plovers, need. And so we were brainstorming, how do you get a volunteer program up and running, and specific challenges of, folks of younger ages joining those volunteer programs too, because some sites have struggled with older volunteers not being able to participate any longer. So we talked about thinking about partnering with community organizations, naturalist organizations, and as a way to really bring in volunteers. And then we also talked about having fun social events as a way to draw a lot of attention to how fun plovers are. So one site talked about how they've had an initial kickoff event at the beginning of the year at a local restaurant, and had a cash bar, and people could sign up to be volunteers then as well. So it does seem like there's lots of interest in, I know, a project that AFSI has talked about, of really providing more resources to sites to learn how to have these volunteer-based programs. So stay tuned. That's something that's definitely been on the radar of AFSI, to provide more resources.
Anything else from the other breakout groups? Any major themes that are related to what we talked about, or something else?
Yeah, I mean, just echoing what Ashley was saying, our breakout group talked a lot about difficulties created by lack of funding for this kind of an initiative, and especially about staffing. I think one of the members of our breakout group said that there was only a couple of them able to work on this particular program. And so just finding ways of doing things cheaply and finding volunteers to help with this was a common theme for us. I think something else that came up was just thinking about what you can do within the constraints of how the area that you're working in change what you're able to do. So one person was talking about difficulties with dealing with boats who are approaching in when they shouldn't be, and how to create signage to stop that. And there were suggestions like an anchored buoy with a sign on it. But depending on what you can do, based on your program or your institution or the space you're in, will change kind of those creative solutions as well. Another one is like, can you use language like prosecute, and things like that.
Great, thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, so our group, we actually leaned a little bit further into the community aspect, and how to kind of get yourself in there and basically making use of what community resources you have available to you. We did have one example that was mentioned, where a member of our breakout room was thinking of getting access to like the local community radio station, with the knowledge that that is a very like localized source of information that a lot of members go through, and kind of figuring out, how to cater your messaging to that sort of medium, and working within that medium. It was ideas were floated in terms of maybe having, little radio trivia competitions with like incentives incorporated, and working with like local shorebird festivals in the area as well. So just kind of making use of the community that's there, and really emphasizing the community component of the messaging. As mentioned by another member, they have had difficulty maybe with the informational based messaging or regulatory based messaging. So instead, kind of moving more towards that idea of, building personal pride in, your local habitats and such.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, so I think hopefully these conversations and these recaps kind of got you thinking about some of the things that you have, or that you need to consider, or what might work at your site if you're just talking about strategies. So all those can be helpful as you move forward with your campaign plan. So thanks for participating in that little discussion. And if you're noticing any gaps in your inputs, Ashley's going to talk about some of the considerations that you can think about to address some of those?
Yeah, so we started to talk a little bit about gaps in terms of volunteers as a way to fill capacity. But I was hoping that folks could put in the chat any other thing that they realize they don't have and what might be a way to fill that gap. So just brainstorm for a minute looking at your list. Is there anything that you have that you notice on there that you don't have yet? And you can put in a possible solution if you have one, or you could just put in what you don't have yet. I'm seeing people resolving the volunteer issue in the chat too. For anyone who's struggling with volunteers, definitely check out the answer. Okay, so money for sure. Okay, what other resources do you need? And then we'll come back to the money situation. Okay, so I'm seeing money, getting all the staff in your organization to buy in. And then enforcement, community buy-in, positive relationships with key stakeholders, graphic design. Okay, let's talk about a couple of these and get brainstorms from folks on what has worked for them. And if you have any other solutions for other people, feel free to reply. You can go on top of someone's comment and a little bubble will pop up in the right that says reply, and you're welcome to suggest ideas from others. So on the enforcement of town resources or town ordinances, this is a challenge that I've heard quite a bit with various organizations that we've worked with. And one of the journal articles that I wrote with a couple of my grad students was about this issue of enforcement and why you need to go voluntary approaches because enforcement tends to be lacking. We can put that article in the link. It's open access if anyone wants to read it. But some of the insights that we did see from the sites who were having some more luck working with enforcement of town resource or town ordinances were sites that really just worked on building one-on-one relationships with the enforcement staff and really trying to understand what their challenges were, finding a champion within the law enforcement group that's relevant for your site. And if you could, and if they got into it, even having trainings for law enforcement officers about the relevant ordinances and why those are important. And in most cases, sites weren't actually ticketing. The law enforcement officers kind of became an outreach component themselves too, but they did find that had more luck. So under Sarah's comment there, I'll put that for enforcement of, I'll put the link that I'm mentioning for enforcement of town ordinances. And anyone else who has suggestions on that one, feel free to comment underneath Sarah's site or Sarah's comment. On the money front, it seems like probably with all of you on the phone here, there's been some really creative fundraising approaches. I suspect some of you have tried crowdsourcing campaigns, finding individual donors who love plovers, finding opportunities to have events. What are any other approaches that anyone could throw in the chat of cool ways that you've raised money or a link to something to share that you've done to raise money? Okay, so Emily threw in the chat that one site has tried selling printed pictures to raise funds as a fundraiser. So another site talked about how they've had Name the Plover contests as a fundraiser as well. So reach out to those folks if you're interested in those. Community buy-in. I heard from one of the sites that came up in the breakout group that my group was having, and there was a lot of conversation about having like library programs, walks on the beach to get people excited about the plovers. I've heard about doing events and festivals. Any other ideas that anyone wants to throw out there about good ways to get community buy-in? Oh, and I see Amanda's thrown out for her agency that working with a local nonprofit has helped because the agency couldn't really fundraise, but the local nonprofit could. All right. Well, throw any more responses that you have to people. I see our team starting to do it, and I encourage the folks on our team, when you're not the one speaking, to put other ideas in the chat for people. And this can be a great thing to brainstorm with your team, or what are the creative ways that you can work around issues? And if you can't work around them, then how can you adjust your strategies? Okay, Sammy, you can advance here because I know we put down a few other things. Or maybe it won't let you
It's
advance.
not advancing for some reason. Okay.
Okay, partners. Yes. So we've talked about that a few times, finding organizations with the same goal or maybe who don't have the same goal, like the Scouts or like another community group that might just be really excited to have something that they can have their team do, or even a local business that might be willing to adopt plovers as their volunteer activity. And then, as I mentioned, possibly scaling back your campaign and focusing on 2 or 3 strategies. And then we talked about ways to seek additional funds.
Cool. Well, it sounds like we chatted, we all had the same ideas of how to address any kind of gaps. So definitely reach out to your peers in the chat and feel free to add your own ideas. These are a good place to start when you're trying to figure things out. Someone's probably in the same challenge or has recently dealt with the same challenge. So this creative space is a really great place to start. So now thinking about how can you assess your strategies, we're going to spend the rest of the conversation talking about metrics for evaluation and focusing on outputs and outcomes. So after figuring out what you want to do and what's feasible to do, we then want to define metrics for assessing our strategies. So basically, metrics are essential for connecting strategies to behavior change goals and then evaluating the success of our campaigns. So you want to define these metrics in advance to help with things like aligning your plan with your goals and then streamlining data collection. And these metrics should directly measure what was accomplished or the success of what you did. And these come in 2 categories, and we refer to them as outputs and outcomes. So outputs are the immediate results and are typically tangible, like the number of products produced or events hosted. And then outcomes occur as a result of the outputs, like improved skills or a change in behavior. So we can think of this like outputs are what you did, and then outcomes are the takeaways of what you did, like what the audience gained. So to identify output and outcome measures, you want to think big picture and maybe even back to our first session on selecting behaviors, because strategies ultimately are designed to encourage the desired behavior. So we'll want to pick metrics to show how they are doing that. So our outputs describe what we did through the strategy, which will have specific things that you will want to track. And then for outcomes, we want to understand the influence and track indicators that relate to our goal. So again, track what we did and then track how it influenced our goal. So here's an example of kind of what that looks like, because I know it can kind of get confusing. So perhaps the strategy I selected is environmental education, which is a subcategory of the communication strategy. So let's say I'm hosting several environmental education events to promote my goal of improving shorebird identification skills, and also just raising awareness about what shorebirds are, because maybe in my area, folks just don't know that there's shorebirds or endangered species on the beach. So maybe through this event, I give a lesson on shorebirds. I distribute some resources to the kids so they can go out and ID birds on the beach themselves. And then maybe we come back and we make some signs showcasing the birds that we saw with some messaging that we can do to help to protect them. So kind of focusing on what to track for your outputs if you did an event like this. You kind of want to figure out what you can measure that aligns directly with your goals, but also showcases exactly what you did. So things like tracking the number of visitors who came, how many identification cards were given out, how many actually participated and got the birds right, how many signs were made to promote awareness, all these good things. So you can also elaborate more qualitatively on these to really highlight and bring context to the data. And then when you think about outcomes, which are as a result of your outputs, you can track things like improved shorebird identification skills or just improved knowledge on shorebirds to really show the connection between the strategy, what you did to implement it, and then what the outcome was and how it influenced the audience. So we'll talk a little bit later in the session about methods you can use to measure these things. But for now, we want you all to take another few minutes to think about some of the potential metrics you might track for each of the strategies that you identified earlier. And just take a few minutes to yourself to jot these down. There's no right or wrong answers, and you don't have to think about feasibility necessarily right now, just anything that might seem relevant. So we'll reconvene at, we'll say 51, 52. Now that is 37. It's kind of quick. Does anybody want to share some of their ideas for outputs or outcomes that came to mind? Maybe if you were thinking about implementing a prompt strategy, what are some of the outputs you thought of that you might want to record? You can just type in the chat. Yeah, I see Amanda said how many new signs installed, how many are relocated. Yeah, that's a really good one. Asking people at Community Day to sign commitments. Yeah, how many people are signing those pledges? How many people attended the event or interacted with the table? Yeah, I think all of these are really important. Interactions with social media, totally. So feel free to keep adding things in the chat, and you might see something that you didn't think of, or just want to add anything else that might be helpful for others. Sorry we didn't get more time to talk about it in a breakout group, but if you have any questions, feel free to just post them in the chat or email me, and I'm happy to chat. So the next thing we want to talk about is how we can track these outputs and outcomes with the remaining time we have left. So when we're tracking metrics, we also want to be mindful of the limitations we might experience when collecting this data, because as we noted earlier, it's these limitations that often prevent us from doing evaluations in the first place. So the first thing to keep in mind is that some metrics will take longer to assess than others, particularly when thinking about outputs versus outcomes. So make sure that you account for your capacity, your funding, time, materials, timelines, anything else that might determine how often data can realistically be collected, and also who will be responsible for collecting it. Because knowing this upfront is really helpful for planning your season. And then on top of that, you should also consider how funding and project reports and seasons might affect how you can measure your outputs and outcomes. So the first thing we want to talk about when thinking about outputs is a pretty simple method of QR codes. So there's two types we're going to dive into, which are static and dynamic. So static QR codes are free, and these are the ones that you see sites for to make a free QR code all the time. And that's a really big benefit, but these types of QR codes can't be changed once they are created. So what I mean by that is if the URL for the site page changes, then that QR code will no longer work. So that's something to keep in mind, especially if your organization is changing platforms or you're relying on sending people to another page that you're not in charge of running. So just keep that in mind with the static QR codes. They also don't track any metrics, but you can link them to sites that are equipped with things like Google Analytics, and you can find a lot of information in that way. And then another benefit of static QR codes is that they don't expire. So as long as the site is active, your QR code will continue to work. And then on the flip side, dynamic QR codes have the benefit of being a little flexible. So websites can be edited, but that's because you pay for a subscription. And once you stop paying for that subscription, will expire. But, through that subscription, you can monitor statistics internally, which it can be a really big benefit as well if you don't have something like Google Analytics. So both of these are good options, but we use static QR codes when we did our campaigns. So here's some examples. So Audubon New York created these great dog signs on the right with a QR code that linked to a website for dog-friendly locations nearby for people to take their pets. And then this one on the right is advertising a wildlife beach area on Tybee Island with a QR code that linked to our project page, which we were actually able to track. So I'll talk about that in a minute. But one thing I wanted to quickly know before I jump into that is that it can be really helpful to print QR codes on stickers. So if your sign gets bleached in the sun or vandalized, you can pop a new one in, no problem, without having to spend additional funds on creating a new sign. But as I was mentioning, when folks scan the QR code that led to our project page, they're taken to our public-facing landing page. So depending on if there were a dog or a beach walker site, that would determine what landing page the visitors would actually get to. But since all of our QR codes across all of our sites were set up to arrive on that same page, in order to track individual campaign success, we set up each QR code with a campaign URL for all of our sites. So this is something you can do for free by searching Campaign URL Builder. So in the campaign ID box, we put the different beach names to know where visitors were scanning from. And then by changing the campaign medium, you can set different forms of outreach. So for example, we had newsletters and signs. So by setting the medium, we can see what people are engaging with and how they're getting to the website. So whether that's through the sign or through the newsletter, and then where they're coming from. And then that automatically goes to Google Analytics if you have that page set up. So in there, we can see what sites are getting the most traction and by what medium. So when you click on one of these sites, so if I were to click on this Folly Beach one, I could then see all the different types of mediums that they have. So out of all of those scans, which ones are the most popular. So, not only can we get output measures of engagement through this type of strategy, we're also able to share insights among each other to kind of improve our campaigns, sharing insights on sign placement when we notice that somebody's getting a lot of scans on a certain type of thing, so that we can continuously adapt and help each other out. And then in terms of recording outputs, we kind of did the same activity that we did earlier when implementing our pilot campaigns in 2022. So we broke down all the various ways the strategies were being implemented, and then we brainstormed together what outputs we might want to record, and then worked as our group to identify which ones were the most important to track, and then how feasible they were, which kind of informed our tracking spreadsheet. So from there, we created this tracking spreadsheet, which is separated by different outreach tabs in the tabs on the bottom. So we asked folks to basically record these metrics at various intervals to hopefully ease some of the workload. And we worked with the staff to kind of set up these different timelines. So this template is actually available on our toolkit, which we'll talk about a little bit later. If you're interested in tracking similar things, there's things related to community outreach events, stewardship, social media, and I think a few others. So then kind of talking about our outcomes, the first method that we wanted to mention is observations. And there's two types that we'll focus on, anecdotal and formal. So anecdotal means that these observations are based on personal accounts. So they can be really flexible and capture insights as they arise. And this is great for stewards or those who have limited time or maybe even the inability to directly interact with beachgoers, like on federal lands. So anecdotal observations give you a lot of opportunistic insights, which can be really helpful. And then on the other hand, formal observations have a structured protocol and methodology that can kind of help eliminate some of the bias that anecdotal observations might risk. And it helps you kind of standardize your data collection and even quantify behaviors, which can be really nice for analyses and reporting. So we use anecdotal observations for our CBSM sites as a way to kind of document changes in behavior on a self-report basis. So we asked all of our participating sites to enter 1 observation a week during the campaign as a way to observe disturbance and voluntary compliance with these messages and the behaviors they were trying to promote. So anyone on the ground could answer this or fill out this form. So we had volunteers, stewards, the land managers, the biologists, everyone had opportunity to submit one of these anecdotal observation forms. So we asked a number of different questions to kind of break down the types of observations and evidence that we were gathering. So kind of starting off with what the site was, the date, the category of the event, but then also providing some context about the experience, what happened, what was significant about it. And this kind of revealed some of the positive and negative interactions that folks were having on the beach. And we encouraged people to report on both of those sides. Then we asked them about the takeaways, what stood out to a person, and then finishing out with some lessons learned. And then since we were in a community of practice, how the community of practice could support folks in navigating these kinds of experiences in the future. So our version might be a little different than other observation reports, but asking these additional questions really helped us get context to the event. And we could even code people's responses and identify common challenges and successes, what's working and not working, and then all of which was helpful in our reporting and to continuously adapt our campaigns together. And then on the flip side, formal observations can be more reliable over self-reported observations since they are unbiased. And being able to observe behavior on this community level is a really good indicator of program success since the responses you're receiving aren't really being influenced. So we did a few observation studies during this project with a graduate student from Germany. And one part involved cameras. We're in the process of reviewing and analyzing that data, but we're looking at people, if they're using this alternative path at high tide, which was the campaign ask at Long Beach, Connecticut. So are they using that alternative path and are they participating in this campaign messaging that's being promoted? And then Milan, the graduate student, is submitting a manuscript soon on his project involving being an unbiased observer on Milford Point Beach in Connecticut to see kind of how people interact with the campaign messaging and signage and stewards and how that influences behavior. So stay tuned for more on that. But these in-depth studies might not always be possible, but that doesn't mean you have to skip collecting data. You can always explore ways to incorporate metrics into existing protocols for efficiency. So if you're already doing biological surveys, even adding a column that's something related to your campaign, like how many dogs are on leash, how many people are walking on the wet sand, whatever it may be, you can add that to existing protocols if that's what works for you. And then lastly, surveys are a good tool for measuring outcomes, especially after events, if you're doing an outreach strategy or communication type of strategy. And while self-reported, it can be really useful information and it can really take a wide variety of forms as well. But the main types of questions you want to ask should involve something along the lines of what the participant learned and what they will do with that new information moving forward. So this could be a short online survey after an event. It could be a group show of hands after an education event. Ultimately something is better than nothing. So having this type of input and insight can be really helpful. And then additionally, you can think about doing follow-up surveys with people who signed a pledge or became a steward. Getting feedback in this way can be really helpful in seeing how our messages are resonating with people, and that insight can help us move forward. So to kind of paint the picture and connect all of our pieces, just wanted to go over 2 brief case studies to talk about what was implemented and then what was found. So the first one comes from Hurdles Beach in Nova Scotia, and our partners at Birds Canada were able to implement a campaign in an effort to improve respect for the symbolic fencing and walk on the wet sand to protect piping plovers. So they had limited staff capacity, so they wanted to do a prompt type of campaign at this site, a very small scale CBSM campaign. So they designed these new signage based on the content that we talked about in these trainings and making sure that people had these very clear asks and then strategically placed them along the site so that people knew what to do in the areas that they were supposed to be doing it. So they revamped their messaging and were able to kind of collect data during their piping plover surveys. So from 2023 compared to 2024, they were able to see an 11% increase in walkers on the wet sand after doing these new signs. They also observed fewer walkers around the nesting area and fewer footprints inside the fenced areas. So that, is an indication of a positive behavior change, but also, needs more time and data to be sure. And then they also wanted to share that one nesting pair produced 3 fledglings. So that is higher than their regional productivity target of 1.65. And then another example is Higgins Beach in Maine. So they did a campaign to leash dogs in the designated buffer zone to prevent disturbance in the restricted area, which you see in that little photo. So they did this through prompts, communication, social diffusion, and incentives, having a lot of stewards and signs within that buffer area and communicating that types of messaging. And then through anecdotal observations that were collected by stewards and the lead volunteers through the project, they were able to interact with 631 people and also noticed that dog walkers were staying clear of that restricted area and turning around within the buffer zone. So without that anecdotal perspective, we might not know exactly how our campaign is resonating with people. So it can be a really great place to start if you're thinking about opportunistic observations. Any questions so far about collecting data?
Tammy, it doesn't look like the questions in the chat have been about collecting data yet. There's been continuing dialogue. One thing I did want to call out to make sure people saw is, in addition to the toolkit specific to CBSM that we've shared with you, Deb wanted to remind everyone that the Atlantic Flyway Shorebird Initiative more broadly keeps track of outreach materials available for Shorebird outreach. And she provided both the link to finding the resources as well as submitting any resources. So lots of you sound like you're super creative on this call and have already created cool things for your sites. So please do enter those resources that you're willing to have other sites share in the database so that people can see those.
Great, thank you. So if you have any more questions, feel free to post them in the chat, but just to be mindful of the couple minutes we have, I'm going to speed through some available resources that can help you with these next steps so that you can take this material and hopefully do something actionable. But through this whole process, you were able to hopefully fill out majority, if not all, of this campaign plan. And this can be a really good tool to start your evaluation planning, but also for communication and decision making and making sure everyone on the team is on the same page, and getting some buy-in from partners and seasonals, and it can be just a really helpful communication tool. And then to speed run through some next steps that we have and available resources, we have 2 guidance documents coming out. One on communities of practice and how to facilitate them and what's the benefits of participating in them. And it can be really helpful in these types of projects that are very collaborative where everyone's doing the same thing. And then also one diving more in depth on these evaluating human behavior change. So thinking about evaluation more formally before, during, and after a campaign. So stay tuned, those will be coming out this spring. We also want to point you to the guidance document, which is also linked in the resource summary sheets after all of the sessions. It's just a really good way to dive more in depth into the framework, and then point you in the direction of our online toolkit, where we talk more about the different strategies with some examples and guidelines and resources to implement. We have lots of examples from along the flyway, with more being added this spring to give you some representation if you're seeing a site that's similar to yours. And then we have a bunch of resources, including some of those evaluation tools that we've talked about, graphics and signage, reports, articles, all of that can be found within our resources tab. And I'll link all of these links in our summary sheet as well. And then also wanted to quickly mention that if you're on the Atlantic Flyway, you can join the Atlantic Flyway Shorebird Initiative AFC Human Activities Committee, or sign up for the newsletter if you're interested in talking more about human disturbance and human recreation. We meet monthly to talk with a group, and we focus our conversations on common challenges and successes that folks are having along the Flyway. So it can be really good community building space if that is of interest to you. And I'll post the link again in the summary sheet so you can sign up if you're interested. But from here, we hope that you'll be able to finalize your campaign plans and then discuss evaluation metrics with your team and figuring out what's feasible. Again, it can be really helpful to meet with a team of partners. So whether that's in your organization and the project, or in a community group like the AFC group, is helpful to kind of share then knowledge, what's being applied and how you can apply it yourself. And then track your outcomes using some type of standardized spreadsheet and be able to report on that. So feel free to post any remaining questions that you have in the chat or email me and I will happily reply to them. But just wanted to take a minute to thank you all for your participation and all of our partners on the ground who made all of this work possible. We really appreciate you sticking through to 3 sessions, and your participation has been valuable. So I'm gonna pass it over to Ashley to close us out.
Great, thanks so much, Sammy, and thank you all for joining us again for our last session. It's been awesome to have such a big bunch of people interested in community-based social marketing, and hoping that some of you will go on to continue this work. It's really important that we get your feedback on this training series. It's the first time we've ever done such a big one. Sammy put together a really short survey that she or Jordan's going to put a link to in the chat. Jordan did just now. Please take just a few minutes as your parting gift to us after having done this to give us your feedback. It's helpful for us for reporting to our funder, and it's also helpful for us for when we do this in the future to make sure it's even more useful. And I hope that you all will do some of this work this summer and that you'll get back in touch with us. Staying in touch with the AFC working group, Human Activities Working Group, is a great way to share what you've been learning or trying, or also just drop Sammy an email if you try out your campaign and want to let her know how it went. Deb also has offered her email in the chat, and she also is available to hear about how your campaign's going or help you along the way. So we hope there's lots of success, and we hope that as a result of this work, we can all work together to make continued incremental progress for more shorebirds and less disturbance on the beach. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you for staying a few minutes extra, and have a great rest of your Valentine's Day and a lovely weekend.
Oh, that's right. We didn't ask how many hearts there were. If anyone wants to tell us your heart count at the end, go for it in the chat. Sammy, there was also a request for us to download the chat and